She laughed first. Then the whole table laughed with her. $100 glass of wine in her hand, green eyes sharp as a scalpel. Victoria Hale leaned across the table in front of everyone. The judge, the executives, the donors in their tuxedos, and aimed the question like a weapon directly at the man in the white Navy uniform. "So tell me, sailor, are you good in bed?" The room erupted. James Calloway didn't flinch. He didn't smirk, didn't flush, didn't reach for his drink. He just looked at her steady quiet, the way a man looks when he has already survived the worst thing a human being can survive, and waited for the laughter to die. Then he said 9 words. 9 words that shut the entire room down cold. And Victoria Hale, the woman who had never once been caught without an answer, felt 2 tears hit her cheeks before she even realized she was crying. Drop your city in the comments. I want to see exactly how far this story travels. And if those 9 words hit you the way they hit that room, subscribe. Because what happens next will stay with you long after this video ends. The charity gala was the last place James Calloway wanted to be on a Thursday night. He had told himself he wouldn't go. He'd repeated it 3 times while ironing his dress whites, twice more while pinning his ribbons, and one final time while standing in front of the bathroom mirror, trying to remember what a man looked like when he wasn't exhausted down to the marrow of his bones. But Commander Hargrove had called personally. "James," the old man had said, "you've turned down the last 4 of these things. People are starting to think you're antisocial." "I am antisocial, sir." "Well, put on your uniform and be antisocial in public for 2 hours. The Children's Hospital needs donors. You can suffer through a dinner for sick kids." He couldn't argue with that. So there he was, ballroom of the Harrington Hotel, downtown Newport, News, Virginia. Crystal chandeliers, linen tablecloths that cost more than his monthly grocery bill. Men in tuxedos laughing too loudly at jokes that weren't funny. Women in dresses that looked like they required instruction manuals. James found his assigned table, shook hands with strangers whose names he immediately forgot, and settled into his chair with the focused patience of a man who had survived worse environments than this. He'd done 2 tours in the Persian Gulf. He could survive a charity dinner. The table seated 10. To his left, a retired judge named Harold. To his right, a real estate developer who kept mentioning properties in a way that felt like he was trying to sell James something. Across from him sat a couple from Richmond who ran some kind of tech company. And at the far end, surrounded by a small orbit of admirers, sat a woman who made everyone at the table sit up a little straighter. James noticed her the way he noticed most things, quietly, without making a show of it. She was striking. Dark hair pinned up in the kind of effortless style that probably took 45 minutes. Sharp green eyes that moved around the room like she was cataloging everything, assessing everyone, calculating angles that nobody else in the room had thought of yet. She laughed at something the man beside her said, but James could tell she wasn't really amused. Her eyes didn't change when she laughed. He'd known people like that. He'd been married to someone who was nothing like that. The thought hit him like it always did, sideways without warning in the middle of the most ordinary moments. Catherine. He reached for his water glass. Took a slow drink. Focus. The dinner moved through its stages. Salad. Soup. The kind of chicken that costs $60 a plate but tastes like it costs $11. Speeches from people who were very passionate about their own generosity. James listened without hearing much. He'd become skilled at that over the past 4 years, the art of being present in body, while the important parts of you were somewhere else entirely. Usually somewhere involving a 7-year-old girl named Sophia, who was currently at home with Mrs. Patterson from next door, probably already asleep, but possibly still awake. Trying to read chapter books she was technically too young for because she refused to accept that any book was beyond her. He smiled at that. "You look like you're somewhere else entirely." He turned. The woman from the end of the table had relocated. She was sitting in the empty chair beside him. Now he hadn't even noticed the exchange, holding a glass of white wine and looking at him with an expression that was somewhere between amused and genuinely curious. "James Calloway," he said. "I know who you are," she said. "Claire, I mean Victoria Hale. I asked Harold about you 20 minutes ago. She glanced toward the retired judge. He told me you were a chief petty officer. Navy, obviously. She nodded at his uniform. Single dad, 7-year-old daughter, and apparently the most difficult man to have a conversation with at any social event in the greater Hampton Roads area. James looked at Harold, who was very deliberately studying his bread roll. Harold talks a lot for a judge, James said. He does, Victoria agreed. But he speaks very highly of you, said you volunteer at the VA hospital every other Saturday, that you've helped 3 veterans in your unit get housing assistance in the last year. She tilted her head slightly. He also said you never talk about any of it, which I find either deeply admirable or deeply suspicious. Could be both. She smiled at that, and this time he noticed her eyes changed. Victoria Hale, he said. Marketing. I've seen your firm's name on a few Navy recruitment campaigns. Guilty. Though I prefer to call it storytelling rather than marketing. Marketing sounds like I'm selling soap. Aren't you? Sometimes. But the Navy campaign was different. Those were real stories. She looked at him carefully. Which brings me back to you. I'm not a real story, James said. I'm just a man at a dinner. Every man at a dinner is a real story, she said. Most of them just aren't interesting ones. Before he could respond, the conversation at the table shifted into something louder and more collective. Someone made a joke about military men that James didn't quite catch. A few people laughed. The real estate developer Greg James had eventually remembered, turned toward him with the particular energy of someone who has had one too many glasses of Merlot and has decided that this constitutes permission to be bold. Hey, Calloway, Greg said loudly enough that several heads turned. You Navy guys have a reputation, you know what I'm saying? He grinned at the people around him, gathering an audience the way people like him always did. Something about sailors in every port. All that time away from home keeps the edge sharp, right? A few people chuckled. James didn't respond. He'd been around enough Greg types to know that silence was frequently more effective than engagement. But then Victoria. He still wasn't sure why she did it. Maybe it was the wine, maybe it was mischief, maybe it was a test she didn't realize she was administering. Victoria set down her glass and leaned slightly toward James with a smile that was perfectly calibrated to be just dangerous enough. So tell me, sailor, she said, and the table went quiet with that specific anticipation that rooms get when someone is about to say something they probably shouldn't. Are you good in bed? The silence that followed was not the absence of sound. It was something physical. Greg froze mid-grin. The couple from Richmond exchanged a quick, startled look. Harold set down his bread roll very carefully. Even the server who had appeared to refill water glasses seemed to pause in a way that suggested he had definitely heard the question. Everyone waited. James had spent 21 years in the United States Navy. He had been in situations that required him to make decisions in seconds that affected the lives of people he was responsible for. He had learned through repetition, through failure, through the particular education that only comes from having no good options, that the most important moments in a man's life are usually the quiet ones, not the explosions, the pauses before them. He set down his fork. He picked up his water glass, took one deliberate sip, and set it back down in the exact same ring it had left on the tablecloth. Then he turned to look at Victoria with an expression so calm that it seemed to change the temperature of the air between them. My daughter, he said, is 7 years old. Her name is Sophia. She has her mother's eyes and her mother's laugh, and every night before she goes to sleep, she checks the front door to make sure it's locked. Not because she's afraid of what's outside. He paused. Because she's afraid I won't come back through it. Nobody moved. I've been deployed 4 times since her mother passed. 4 times I've had to sit on the edge of her bed and explain in words a little girl can understand why daddy has to go away again. 4 times I've watched her face do that thing. His voice didn't break, but something in it shifted like weight redistributing. That thing children's faces do when they're trying to be brave for you because they know you need them to be. Victoria's wine glass was still in her hand. She had forgotten it was there. So when you ask me if I'm good in bed, James continued, his voice so steady, it seemed to make the unsteadiness of everything else in the room more obvious. The only answer I can give you is this. Sophia sleeps through the night. She doesn't have nightmares. She doesn't cry for her mother the way she used to in those first 2 years. He looked directly at Victoria, and every single morning she wakes up and the first thing she does is come down the hall and knock on my door, not because she needs something, just to make sure I'm still there. A beat. That's the only bet I care about. The table was absolutely silent. Somewhere across the ballroom, a different conversation was happening. Glasses were clinking. A band was setting up near the far wall. The rest of the world was moving at its regular speed. But at table 14, nobody breathed. Greg, who had started the whole trajectory with his comment about sailors in every port, was staring at the centerpiece with the focused intensity of a man who very badly wished he were somewhere else. Harold, who had predicted none of this when he'd agreed to attend, was looking at James with an expression that hadn't been on his face since he'd watched his son graduate from law school. And Victoria Hale. Victoria, who had built her entire career on reading rooms, on understanding what people needed to feel and how to make them feel it, who had sat across the table from Fortune 500 CEOs and never once been caught off guard. Victoria was crying, not dramatically, not in a way she would have chosen. Just 2 tears, one from each eye, moving silently down her face, before she could marshal the resources to stop them. She set her wine glass down. She looked at James, and for the first time in longer than she could honestly remember, she had absolutely nothing to say. James left the gala at 9:15. He drove home along the route he always drove, the one that passed the elementary school, then the park with the broken swing that the city had been promising to fix for 6 months, then the left turn onto Meridian Street, where the streetlight at the corner had been out for 3 weeks. He made a mental note, the way he always did, to call the city about the streetlight tomorrow. Mrs. Patterson was asleep in the armchair in the living room, the television murmuring at low volume. He thanked her quietly, helped her to her car, locked the front door behind him. Then he went upstairs. He stood in the doorway of Sophia's room for a long moment. She was asleep on her side, one arm wrapped around the stuffed elephant she'd had since she was 2, her hair spread out across the pillow the way Catherine's used to spread across theirs. The nightlight threw a soft orange glow across her face. James leaned against the doorframe. He thought about the ballroom, the silence after he'd spoken, the way Victoria's face had changed. He thought about what it meant that he'd said those words out loud in front of strangers, words he usually kept in the cabinet below the sink, where he kept all the things that were too important to leave, where they might get bumped. He thought about the way Sophia had looked that morning when he'd left for work, standing at the kitchen window in her pajamas, fogging up the glass with her breath. "Don't forget to come home, Daddy." "Never," he'd said. He pushed off the door frame and walked quietly to her bed. He pulled the blanket up an inch. He pressed a careful kiss to her hair. Then he went to his own room, sat on the edge of his own bed, loosened his collar, and put his face in his hands. Not because he was broken, because some days the weight of being someone's whole world was so enormous and so beautiful that there was no way to carry it except to stop moving for a moment. He sat there for a while. Then he got up, hung his uniform, and went to sleep. He didn't think about Victoria Hale again that night. Or at least he told himself he didn't. The truth, which he would have admitted to no one, not even Harold, was that somewhere in the space between closing his eyes and falling asleep, he thought about the way her eyes had changed when she smiled, and how he hadn't seen anyone look at him the way she'd looked at him after he spoke. Not with pity, not with admiration exactly, with something else, something he didn't have a word for yet. He filed it in the cabinet, closed the door, and told himself it didn't matter. He was wrong, but he wouldn't find that out until later. And by then, everything was already changing. 3 days after the gala, Victoria told herself she had forgotten about James Calloway. She was good at forgetting men. She had built an entire system around it. Keep the schedule full, keep the calendar loud, keep the mind occupied with campaigns and client calls and quarterly projections, until whatever inconvenient feeling had started growing simply ran out of oxygen and died quietly. The system had never failed her, until Monday morning when she was sitting in her office on the 14th floor reviewing copy for a veterans outreach campaign, and she read the phrase, "Those who serve sacrifice more than we see," and had to set the paper down and stare at the wall for a full minute and a half. She picked up her phone. She put it back down. She picked it up again and called Harold. "I need James Calloway's number," she said before he even finished saying hello. There was a pause on Harold's end that communicated several things simultaneously: surprise amusement and the particular satisfaction of a 72-year-old man who had correctly predicted something nobody asked him to predict. "Good morning to you too, Victoria." "Harold, I'm having my coffee." "Harold, please." Another pause. She could hear him smiling through the phone, which was one of the more irritating things about Harold Briggs. His smile was audible. "I'll send it to you," he said. "But I want you to know something first." "What?" "That man has been through more than most people will face in 3 lifetimes, and he doesn't let anyone in, not because he's cold." Harold's voice shifted into something more careful. "Because he's protecting something." "I know," Victoria said. "I'm not going to hurt him." "I know you're not going to try to," Harold said. "That's not quite the same thing." She almost called James 4 times over the next 2 days. Each time she talked herself out of it. She had reasons, good ones, she told herself. She barely knew the man. They'd had one conversation at a table full of strangers. She had asked him an embarrassing question in public, and then cried in front of him, which was not exactly the foundation of a dignified relationship. And besides, men like James Calloway didn't need someone like her walking into their carefully structured lives with her chaos and her campaigns and her inability to sit still for longer than 40 minutes. She had almost fully convinced herself of all of this when she ran into him at the VA hospital. She was there for work, a site visit for the outreach campaign photographs, interviews with staff. Her assistant Marcus was beside her with a clipboard, and they were moving through the corridor on the 2nd floor when she turned a corner and nearly collided with a man carrying 2 cups of coffee and a stack of folders. James caught the folders before they hit the ground. The coffee less successfully, 1 cup tilted and sent a thin stream across the hallway floor, and he looked at it with the expression of a man who has decided that this particular catastrophe does not warrant a significant emotional response. Then he looked up. They stood there for a moment in the corridor, 2 people who had been trying not to think about each other for 72 hours now, 4 feet apart, in a fluorescent-lit hospital hallway. "You work here?" Victoria asked. "Volunteer," he said. "Every other Saturday." He looked at the clipboard in Marcus's hands, then at the lanyard around her neck that identified her as a visitor with the Newport News Veterans Outreach Initiative. "You're doing the campaign. Apparently we keep ending up in the same rooms." "Apparently." Marcus was looking between the 2 of them with the focused attention of a 26-year-old who had worked for Victoria long enough to know when he was witnessing something that had nothing to do with the campaign. "I'll go check in with the communications director," Marcus said without being asked, and disappeared down the hallway at a speed that suggested he had somewhere very important to be. Victoria looked at James. James looked at the coffee on the floor. "Can I help you clean that up?" she offered. "It's fine," he said. "The cleaning staff here is excellent. I'd rather not insult them by making it worse." That made her smile despite herself. They stood there for another moment, and Victoria was aware, in the particular way she was aware of most things, that she had a choice. She could say something professional, something that acknowledged the gala, without dwelling on it, something that moved them both forward into polite, manageable distance. She was very good at that. It was practically a professional skill. Instead, she said, "I thought about calling you." James was quiet for a beat. "But you didn't," he said. "No." "Why not?" She considered lying. She was capable of it, not out of malice, just out of the survival instinct that comes from spending 20 years in rooms where showing your cards too early is how you lose. But something about the fluorescent light and the spilled coffee, and the way he was looking at her like he had all the time in the world, and absolutely no interest in pretending made lying feel beside the point. "Because I didn't know what to say," she admitted. "And I'm not used to that." James nodded slowly, like this was information he was filing away rather than responding to. "What were you going to volunteer here today?" she asked. "I run a group session on Friday afternoons," he said. "Veterans dealing with transition, coming back from deployment, figuring out what civilian life looks like, how to talk to their families again." He shifted the remaining coffee cup to his other hand. "Today I'm just dropping off some materials for next week and checking in on a few guys individually." "Do you enjoy it?" He thought about the question in a way that suggested he didn't get asked it very often. "I don't know if enjoy is the right word," he said. "It feels necessary, like—" He paused. "You know when a machine is running wrong and you can hear it, that particular sound, and you can't unhear it once you've heard it?" She nodded. "That's what I hear when I talk to these guys," he said. "Men who did everything right, who served, who came home, and now they're sitting in their houses not sleeping and not talking, and their wives don't know what happened to the person they married." He looked down the hallway. "I was almost one of them. After Catherine died. I could feel myself becoming that." His voice was matter-of-fact, not theatrical. "So I come here because I know what it sounds like when a machine is running wrong. And sometimes that's enough." Victoria didn't say anything for a moment. Then she said, "That's one of the most honest things anyone has ever said to me." "People are usually more honest in hospitals," James said. "Something about the lighting." She laughed genuinely, unexpectedly, the kind of laugh that comes out before you've had a chance to make it appropriate. James almost smiled. Almost. She ran into him again 11 days later at a city council meeting about funding for veterans' housing assistance. She hadn't known he'd be there. He hadn't known she'd be there. They ended up sitting 3 seats apart in the public gallery and spent 2 hours listening to a city councilman explain in great and painful detail why the existing budget was not structured to accommodate additional housing expenditures at this time. Halfway through the third speaker, James leaned slightly toward her without looking at her and said quietly enough that only she could hear, "He's been using the phrase fiscal architecture for 40 minutes, and I still don't know what it means." Victoria pressed her lips together to keep from laughing out loud. "It means no," she whispered back. "Then why doesn't he just say no?" "Because fiscal architecture sounds like a reason. No sounds like a choice." James was quiet for a moment. "I spent 21 years in the Navy," he said, still barely above a whisper. "We said no all the time. We just called it not operationally viable." She did laugh, then quietly into her hand, and the woman on her other side gave her a look, and she didn't care, even slightly. After the meeting, they stood on the steps outside, and James told her about the 3 veterans he was trying to help secure housing for men who had done everything the system asked of them and were now caught in a bureaucratic loop that seemed specifically designed to exhaust people into giving up. "What are you going to do?" she asked. "Keep showing up," he said. "That's usually all you can do. Keep showing up until someone gets tired of seeing your face and gives you what you need. That's either very patient or very stubborn." "In my experience," James said, "those are the same thing." She offered to help. She knew people on the council, knew people who knew people, had spent 15 years building the kind of professional network that existed precisely for moments when the system needed to be nudged from the outside. James looked at her carefully when she offered in a way that told her he was deciding whether the offer was genuine or whether it was the kind of offer people made without intending to follow through. "Why?" he asked. It was a fair question. Direct, no softening around it. "Because it's the right thing to do," she said. And then because he was still looking at her with that careful measuring look. "And because I want to." He nodded once slowly. "All right," he said. They exchanged numbers in the parking lot. Professionally, practically like 2 people who had agreed to work on something together. Victoria drove home, telling herself that was exactly what this was, professional, practical, collaborative. She almost believed it. Over the following weeks, something began to take a shape that neither of them had designed, and both of them were aware of. They texted about the housing case. Then about a second case James brought to her attention. Then she sent him a link to an article about veteran transition programs that made her think of what he'd said at the hospital, and he responded 20 minutes later with a link to a study that complicated the article's conclusions, and somehow that led to a 45-minute phone call at 10 o'clock on a Tuesday night that covered the housing crisis, the structural failures of post-deployment support systems. Whether Harold had always been that nosy, or if it was a retirement thing, and the specific horror of parent-teacher conferences when you are a single father who has absolutely no idea what questions to ask. "What do you mean you don't know what to ask?" Victoria said. "I go in there and the teacher starts talking and I'm nodding and I'm following, I understand the words, but I feel like everyone else got a manual that I didn't receive." "There's no manual." "There has to be a manual. All the other parents seem like they got one." "James, those parents are just as lost as you are. They're just better at pretending." A pause. "That is either the most reassuring thing you've ever said to me," he said, "or the most terrifying." "Probably both," she said. "Yeah," he said. "Probably both." She heard him exhale something between a sigh and a laugh, and she found herself smiling at her phone in the dark of her apartment in a way she hadn't smiled in longer than she wanted to calculate. She met Sophia by accident. It was a Saturday afternoon, and Victoria had stopped at the farmer's market near James's neighborhood to pick up something for a client dinner that evening. She was standing at a vegetable stand, trying to remember if her client had mentioned being vegetarian, when she heard a very confident small voice beside her say, "Those tomatoes aren't good." She looked down, a little girl 7 years old with Catherine's eyes, though Victoria didn't know that yet, and a navy blue jacket 2 sizes too big, standing with her hands in her pockets and looking at the tomatoes with the critical authority of someone who had opinions and was not afraid of them. "They're not," Victoria said. "The good ones are over there." The girl pointed 2 stalls down. "My dad says you can tell by the color. These ones are too orange, the red ones are sweeter." She looked up at Victoria. "He's really good at tomatoes." "Is he?" Victoria said. "He's really good at a lot of things," the girl said with the particular confidence of someone stating an objective fact. "He makes really good pancakes, and he knows how to fix the dryer when it makes that noise, and he can braid hair even though he learned from YouTube." She considered this for a moment. "He's not very good at braiding the front part, though. That part always looks a little weird." Victoria was smiling so hard, her face hurt. "He sounds like a pretty remarkable person," she said. "He is," the girl said simply. "I'm Sophia." "I'm Victoria." Sophia looked at her with those sharp, careful eyes. Catherine's eyes, James's attention, and something moved across her face. "You're the lady from the gala?" she said. Victoria blinked. "How do you know about the gala?" "Mrs. Patterson told me. She said Dad came home looking like he'd seen a ghost." Sophia tilted her head. "You don't look like a ghost. I'll take that as a compliment." "It was one," Sophia said with the gravity of a child who means exactly what she says. James appeared from the next stall over a paper bag in one arm and his phone in his hand and stopped when he saw them. For a moment, he just stood there reading the scene the way he read every room, and something crossed his face that he immediately carefully put away somewhere private. "I see you found the tomato expert," Victoria said. "She finds everyone," James said. He looked at Sophia. "We talked about talking to strangers." "She's not a stranger," Sophia said. "She's Victoria. She's the lady who made you look like you'd seen a ghost." She looked between them with the unnerving perceptiveness of a child who has spent a lot of time paying close attention to adults. "Can she come get hot chocolate with us?" James looked at Victoria. Victoria looked at James. "Only if your father wants company," she said, which she knew was the right thing to say because it handed the decision to him without pressure, without performance. James was quiet for a second and a half. She counted. "There's a place 2 blocks from here," he said. "They make it with real chocolate. None of that powder." "That," Victoria said, "sounds exactly right." They walked the 2 blocks in the late afternoon light. Sophia between them talking continuously about tomatoes braiding techniques. A book she was reading that was apparently above her reading level, but she didn't see why that should stop her. And a bird she'd seen from the school window that she was fairly certain was a type of hawk, but her teacher said was just a pigeon, and she respectfully disagreed. James walked beside Victoria and didn't say much, but once when Sophia ran 3 steps ahead to peer into a bookshop window, he turned to Victoria and said quietly, "She likes you." "I like her," Victoria said. He nodded, didn't say anything else, but his shoulders, which Victoria had noticed over weeks of watching him, were almost always set in that particular way, braced, ready, dropped just slightly, just enough. And she noticed. She noticed in the way she had started noticing everything about him, the way a person notices the details of something they are trying very hard not to want too much. At the hot chocolate place, Sophia sat across from them and wrapped both hands around her mug and looked at Victoria with those eyes and said out of nowhere the way children say things, "Do you have any kids?" "No," Victoria said. "Do you want some?" "Sophia," James said. "It's a regular question," Sophia said unbothered. Victoria looked at the little girl across the table at the jacket 2 sizes too big, and the hawk pigeon certainty, and the tomato expertise and said honestly, "I never really thought about it the right way until recently." Sophia seemed to find this acceptable. She nodded and went back to her hot chocolate. James was looking at his own mug, but Victoria saw the corner of his mouth move. Just slightly. Just enough. The hot chocolate afternoon should have been a warning. James knew that. He knew it the way he knew most things that mattered not through reasoning, but through the particular instinct that 21 years of military service builds in a man, when the situation in front of him is more dangerous than it appears. Victoria Hale was more dangerous than she appeared. Not because she was cruel, not because she was dishonest, but because she was exactly the kind of person who could walk into the careful load-bearing structure of his life and without meaning to, without trying, make him want things he had already finished wanting. He had finished wanting things for himself 3 years ago. It wasn't a decision he'd made consciously. It wasn't dramatic. It was the way a river changes course gradually under pressure, until one day you look up and realize the water is going somewhere different than it used to go. After Catherine, after the first year of grief, and the second year of just surviving, and the third year of building something functional out of what was left, he had simply redirected everything. Every ounce of wanting, every unit of hope, every reserve of tenderness, all of it rerouted toward Sophia. That was enough. That was more than enough. That was everything. He had believed that completely. Right up until a woman with sharp green eyes crouched down at a farmer's market and listened to his 7-year-old daughter explain tomato selection with the full seriousness the subject deserved. He started pulling back 3 days after the hot chocolate. Not abruptly, he wasn't trying to be unkind. He answered her texts a little slower. He kept their conversations on the housing case professional, purposeful, away from the edges where things had started to drift into something that didn't have a name he was ready to give it. When she suggested grabbing coffee to go over the latest council response together, he said he had a scheduling conflict, which was technically true in the way that most avoidance is technically true. Victoria noticed. He knew she noticed. She was too perceptive not to. But she didn't push. She gave him the space he was creating, and somehow that made the space feel worse rather than better, because a woman who understood when to stop pressing was considerably more dangerous than one who didn't. He was managing. He was almost convinced he had it handled. Then Brandon Cole walked back into town. James had heard through Harold, who remained against all reasonable expectation, the most reliable intelligence source in his social network, that Brandon Cole had returned to Newport News after 3 years in New York. Brandon Cole, who had dated Victoria for 2 years before that, who had left for a senior VP position at a Manhattan firm, and apparently decided now that he was back in Virginia for a regional expansion project, that Victoria was something worth revisiting. James told himself it was none of his business. He told himself this 4 times over the course of one Thursday morning which was approximately 3 times more than a thing needs to be said before it stops being convincing. He heard about the dinner from Marcus, Victoria's assistant, who had apparently decided at some point that James was trustworthy enough to share information with a decision James hadn't asked for, but now found himself the recipient of. She didn't look happy about it, Marcus said. They were standing outside the VA building after a meeting with the housing coordinator, and Marcus had the careful tone of someone who is sharing information while maintaining plausible deniability about having shared it. Cole called her directly, said he wanted to catch up. She told me she was going as a professional courtesy. That's her business, James said. Sure, Marcus said in the tone of a man who disagreed completely. James drove home thinking about professional courtesy. He made Sophia dinner the good pasta, not the box kind, because she'd had a hard week at school and she deserved the good pasta, and listened to her talk about the hawk pigeon situation, which had escalated to the point where she had written a 2-page report on regional bird species to present to her teacher, and he told her it was the most thorough argument he had ever seen, and that she should absolutely present it. Will she listen? Sophia asked. I don't know, he said honestly. But that's not the only reason to make a good argument. Sophia considered this with the seriousness she gave all important questions. What's the other reason? So you know you said what was true, he said, regardless of whether anyone listened. She nodded slowly. Like when you told that man at the dinner that you were a good dad, she said. Even though he was being mean. James went very still. You heard that. I wasn't supposed to be in the hallway, she said with the matter-of-fact honesty of a child who has decided confession is preferable to guilt. But I was, and I heard what you said. She looked at her pasta. I didn't know you missed Christmases because of me. Hey. He reached across the table and put his hand over hers. I missed some Christmases because of duty, not because of you. There's a difference. But you said, I said I missed them. I didn't say I regretted being your dad for one single second of any of it. He waited until she looked up at him. You understand that? She looked at him for a long moment with those eyes. Yeah, she said quietly. I understand that. They finished dinner, and he helped her with her bird report, and she fell asleep on the couch somewhere around page 3, report still in her hand, and he carried her upstairs and tucked her in and stood in her doorway for a long time. Then he went downstairs and called Victoria. She picked up on the second ring. James. She sounded he couldn't identify it exactly, not unhappy, but something was in her voice that hadn't been there 2 weeks ago. How was the dinner? He asked. A pause. Harold, she said flatly. Marcus, actually. I'm going to have a conversation with Marcus. He's loyal to you, James said. He just also has feelings about the situation. Everyone has feelings about the situation, Victoria said. Nobody asked them. How was it? Another pause, longer this time. Brandon wants to try again, she said. Brandon has a way of presenting things that makes them sound reasonable. He's good at that. It's actually what made him good at his job. She exhaled. He laid out a very logical case for why the timing is different now. James's hand tightened slightly on the phone. What did you say? I said I needed to think about it. Silence. James. Her voice shifted into something more direct, more stripped of the professional surface. Why did you pull back? He hadn't expected her to ask it that plainly. He should have. It was exactly how she operated, direct and unadorned when it mattered, but he'd been prepared for a longer approach, and instead, she just walked straight through the wall he'd built. He considered his options. Because this scares me, he said. What does this, you? He sat down on the kitchen chair. Sophia already likes you, and He stopped, started again. When Catherine died, I thought the worst part was the grief. But the worst part is actually what comes after. When the grief gets quieter and you start to see things again, want things again, because wanting things again means you can lose them again. Victoria was quiet on her end. "I'm not Catherine," she said gently. Not defensively, just as a fact. "I know that, and I'm not asking you to pretend the last 4 years didn't happen. I know that too. So what are you asking for?" He rubbed his face with one hand. "Time, I think. I don't know. I'm better at knowing what I'm afraid of than knowing what I want." "That's honest," she said. "I'm trying. James." A beat. "I told Brandon no." He hadn't expected that either. "Before you called?" he asked. "While you were making pasta, presumably," she said, and he could hear something in her voice that was almost a smile. "I sat across from him at a very nice restaurant and listened to his very logical case, and I thought, this is a reasonable man. This is a sensible option. This is exactly the kind of relationship that would be easy and uncomplicated and make complete practical sense. And I kept thinking about a man who taught himself to braid his daughter's hair from YouTube videos." A pause. "I couldn't make the math work after that." James sat in his kitchen for a long moment, holding the phone, listening to the quiet of his house. "I don't know how to do this without being terrified," he said finally. "Nobody does," she said. "Anyone who tells you otherwise is either lying or hasn't risked enough yet." He exhaled, a long, slow breath. "Can I take you to dinner?" he said. "Not a networking event, not a council meeting, not a farmer's market. An actual dinner." "Yes," she said without hesitation. "You can." He was still afraid. But he picked a place and he made a reservation, and he told Mrs. Patterson he needed her for a Friday evening and didn't explain why, because Mrs. Patterson was also Herald adjacent in terms of information management, and he wasn't prepared for that network to activate yet. The dinner was at a small Italian place in Ghent that he'd been to once with Catherine, which he realized too late, and spent the first 10 minutes at the table quietly making peace with. Victoria noticed him go somewhere for a moment, and didn't ask about it. Just ordered sparkling water and started talking about the city council's latest non-answer on the housing case in a way that gave him time to come back. That was the thing about her he was learning. She knew how to give people room without making the room feel like abandonment. They talked for 3 hours, not about campaigns or councils or cases, about his 21 years, the first deployment at 22, the feeling of standing on a ship deck in the middle of the ocean and genuinely not knowing if you were going to make it back. About Catherine a little, the way she used to leave sticky notes on the refrigerator, the way Sophia had her laugh. About Victoria's own history. A father who had left when she was 9, a mother who had worked 2 jobs and refused to let either of them become a reason to stop moving forward, a long education in self-sufficiency that had served her professionally and cost her personally. "I'm good at everything except staying," she said at some point in the 3rd hour, looking at her wine glass with the careful honesty of someone making a confession they've been holding for a while. "I move fast. I make decisions fast. I get restless when things get settled." She looked up. "That's why Brandon was always frustrated with me. He wanted a plan. I always wanted the next thing." "What changed?" James asked. She looked at him steadily. "I met someone whose next thing was already decided," she said. "And it made me want to understand what it looks like to build something instead of just moving through things." James held her gaze. "That's either the beginning of something real," he said quietly, "or it's something you feel right now that passes when the novelty does." "I know," she said. "I can't prove which one it is. Not yet." "Neither can I." "So what do we do?" He was quiet for a moment. "We find out?" he said, carefully. She nodded. "Carefully." She agreed. They were finding out carefully, slowly, in the way of 2 people who have both been damaged by speed and are trying to learn a different pace for the next 6 weeks. 6 weeks of dinners, of long phone calls after Sophia was asleep, of Saturday afternoons where Victoria began appearing at the edge of their routines so gradually that Sophia accepted her presence the way you accept weather, not as an intrusion, but as something that changes the quality of the air. 6 weeks, and then Brandon Cole decided he wasn't finished. James heard about the gala 2 days before it happened. The Hampton Roads Business Leaders Annual Fundraiser. A much larger event than the charity dinner where he and Victoria had first met. 400 guests, black tie, the kind of event where serious money changed hands and serious reputations were made or damaged. Brandon Cole was attending. He had made a significant donation to secure a table near the front and had, according to Marcus, made several pointed comments to mutual acquaintances about reconnecting with people who mattered to him. James went because Victoria asked him to. She didn't tell him about Brandon. He didn't tell her he already knew. They arrived together, and James spent the first 40 minutes of the evening doing what he was good at. Reading the room, locating the threat, staying calm. Brandon Cole found them at the bar. He was exactly what James had expected. Tall, polished, the particular confidence of a man who has never had to develop character, because charm always got there first. He shook James's hand with a grip that was 1 degree too firm, and looked at him with eyes that were doing the same calculation James was doing, just less quietly. "You're the Navy man," Brandon said. Not a question. "James Calloway," James said. "Brandon Cole." He held the handshake a beat longer than necessary. "Victoria's told me a lot about you." "She hasn't mentioned you," James said pleasantly. Victoria made a small sound beside him that might have been a suppressed laugh. Brandon's smile held. He was good at that, keeping the smile in place while everything behind it rearranged. He turned to Victoria, and they exchanged the kind of conversation that happens between people who have a long history and an unresolved ending. And James stood beside her and didn't perform discomfort and didn't perform confidence. He just stood there, the way he had stood on the deck of a ship in bad weather, present, grounded, waiting. But Brandon wasn't done. An hour later, at a moment that James understood immediately was not accidental, Brandon approached the cluster of guests surrounding James and Victoria and someone from the city council, and he did the thing that men like him do when they've decided that subtlety has stopped serving them. He made it public. "I have to say," Brandon said loudly enough for the surrounding guests to hear, addressing the group, but looking at James, the way a man looks at something he's decided to pick up and examine. "I have enormous respect for military service. Enormous. But I'm curious." And the smile sharpened just slightly. "What does a Navy man actually bring to a woman like Victoria's life? I mean, practically speaking. The deployments, the income, the lifestyle." He spread his hands in a gesture of reasonable inquiry that was not reasonable at all. "I'm just asking what everyone's thinking." The cluster of guests went quiet in the specific way that people go quiet when they understand that they are about to witness something and haven't yet decided whether they want to. Victoria's hand tightened on her glass. James felt it, the anger underneath the stillness, the way she was deciding whether to answer herself or let him answer or end the evening entirely. He touched her hand. Just once, just lightly. Then he looked at Brandon Cole. And the expression on his face was something that Brandon, for all his polish and preparation, had never learned to produce, the absolute weathered calm of a man who has stood in worse storms than this and knows exactly how long they last. "You want to know what I bring," James said. Not a question. Brandon's smile held. "I've been deployed 4 times since my wife died," James said. His voice was level, conversational, carrying to the people around them without performing for them. 4 times I left a little girl who needed me. 4 times I came back and had to learn who she'd become while I was gone." He paused. "I bring a daughter who has never once, not one single night, gone to sleep unsure whether her father loves her. I bring 21 years of keeping my word in conditions where it would have been very easy not to." He looked at Brandon directly. "What I bring can't be summarized in a lifestyle question. And frankly, the fact that you think it can tells me everything I need to know about what you brought." The silence was complete. Someone in the cluster cleared their throat and looked away. Brandon's smile was still technically present, but it had lost its structure, like a building that looks intact from the outside after the supports have gone. Victoria turned to James. She wasn't crying this time. She was looking at him with something that was past admiration and past attraction, and closer to the recognition you feel when you see something true. "Let's get some air," she said. They walked outside, and the night was cool, and behind them the ballroom continued its noise, and Brandon Cole stood in the middle of it alone, surrounded by people who were suddenly very interested in their drinks. "You didn't have to do that," Victoria said. "I know," James said. "But you did." "Yeah." She looked at him for a long moment. "James." She stopped walking. "I'm not restless anymore." He turned to face her. "I want to build something," she said. "With you. With Sophia. I know this is careful and slow, and I know you're still afraid, and I am too, but I want—" She stopped. Took a breath. "I want to stay." James stood in the night air outside the ballroom. He thought about the cabinet below the sink where he kept the things too important to leave, where they might get bumped. He thought about Sophia checking the front door lock every night. He thought about the sticky notes on the refrigerator. He thought about a river that changes course. "Okay," he said. Just that. But the way he said it, the weight of it, the fullness of it, the sheer cost of what it meant for him to say it, made it the longest word he had spoken in years. She reached out and took his hand. He held it. And for the first time in 4 years, the careful, load-bearing structure of his life shifted to make room for something new. The word "okay" turned out to be the hardest thing James Calloway had ever built. Harder than any deployment. Harder than the first year after Catherine. Harder than standing in front of 400 people and refusing to flinch under Brandon Cole's particular brand of cruelty. Because deployments had protocols. Grief had a shape even when that shape was unbearable. And Brandon Cole was just a man with too much money and too little character, a problem James had the tools to handle. But okay, that single word standing in the night air outside a ballroom, that was something else entirely. That was a promise made without a manual, without a map, without any guarantee that the ground on the other side of it was solid enough to hold 2 people and a 7-year-old girl who checked the front door lock every night. He drove home that evening and sat in his car in the driveway for 12 minutes before going inside. Mrs. Patterson was asleep in the armchair again. He thanked her quietly, walked her to her car, locked the door, went upstairs, stood in Sophia's doorway. She was asleep on her back, with her arms spread wide, the bird report on the nightstand, the stuffed elephant wedged between the pillow and the wall. She had gotten the front part of her own braid halfway decent that week. She'd been practicing on the elephant. James leaned against the doorframe and looked at his daughter for a long time. "I'm trying," he said quietly to no one and everyone. Then he went to bed and didn't sleep much, and was up by 5:15 making coffee, which was how most significant chapters of his life had begun. The first real test came 11 days later. Not from Brandon Cole. Brandon had retreated with the dignity of a man who has decided that a tactical withdrawal is not the same as a defeat which James respected in a distant professional way. The test came from Sophia. She asked about Victoria at breakfast on a Tuesday directly and without preamble, the way she asked about everything that mattered. "Is Victoria your girlfriend?" James set down his coffee mug. "Where did you hear that word?" "School," Sophia said. "Emma's brother has a girlfriend. Emma says it means you like someone more than a regular friend and you hold their hand." She looked at him with Catherine's eyes. "You held her hand outside the restaurant last week. I saw from the window when you came home." James made a note, not for the first time, that his daughter missed absolutely nothing. "We're figuring things out," he said carefully. "That means yes," Sophia said, and went back to her cereal. "It means I don't want to give you a label that might not be accurate yet," he said. Sophia looked up at him with a patience that seemed frankly a little advanced for 7. "Dad," she said, "I know you're scared." He blinked. "I'm not—" "You get a face," she said. "When you're scared about something but you don't want to say it, you get a face. It's kind of like your regular face, but tighter." She demonstrated, pressing her lips together and slightly narrowing her eyes, and it was so accurate that he felt it like a physical thing in the center of his chest. "You've had that face a lot lately." He sat back in his chair. "When did you get so perceptive?" he asked. "I've always been perceptive," she said. You just don't always notice because you're busy having the face." He laughed, a genuine one, unprepared, the kind that comes from somewhere real. "Do you like her?" he asked. "Victoria, honestly." Sophia thought about it. She took this seriously, which he appreciated. She didn't give automatic answers to questions she considered important. "She listens," Sophia said finally. "Like, actually listens. Not like grown-ups usually listen, where they're waiting for you to stop talking." She poked at her cereal. "And she asked me about my bird report, and she called my teacher to ask about the hawk thing." James stared. "She called your teacher? She said she was doing research for a project," Sophia said with a small smile that indicated she was fully aware this was not entirely true. "My teacher looked it up and said she thought it might actually be a red-tailed hawk after all. So I was right." She shrugged, satisfied. "I like someone who does their homework." James sat with that for a moment. "She called your teacher," he said again, more to himself than to Sophia. "You have the face again," Sophia observed. "But a different kind." He called Victoria on his lunch break. "You called Sophia's teacher," he said. "A beat." "I did research," Victoria said carefully. "About a bird. About regional raptor species and their habitat overlap with urban elementary school environments, yes?" "Victoria, she was right, James. It was clearly a red-tailed hawk. The pigeon classification was doing a disservice to the scientific record and to a very thorough second grader." He stood outside the VA building in the November air, with his hand pressed over his mouth to keep the laugh contained, because he was in a professional environment and there were people around, but he was losing that particular battle comprehensively. "Thank you," he said, when he had recovered enough to mean it properly. "I didn't do it for you," Victoria said, and her voice had shifted into something quieter. "I did it because she deserved to be right." He stood there for a moment in the cold air. "I know," he said. That was the thing about Victoria. She did things not because they were strategic or because they served a purpose in some larger design, but because she saw what was right in front of her and responded to it. He had spent enough time around people who acted from calculation to recognize with some relief when someone was acting from something else. The second test was harder. His deployment orders came through on a Wednesday afternoon in December. Not a full deployment, a 6-week operational assignment, classified enough that he couldn't explain the details beginning in February. 6 weeks. He'd done longer. He'd done 6 months. But 6 weeks had never felt like this before. He told Victoria on a Thursday evening after Sophia was asleep, sitting across from her at his kitchen table with his coffee going cold. And he watched her face cycle through several things very quickly. A flash of something that wasn't quite fear, but was adjacent to it. Then a careful settling, then the particular composure of a woman who has learned to handle the drop. 6 weeks, she said. Yes. February. 2nd week. She wrapped both hands around her mug. Okay. Okay, he said. What would you like me to say, James? I don't know. Something. He looked at her. The last person I told about a deployment the last time I sat at this table and said these words. He stopped. Catherine used to go very quiet, for about 3 minutes, and then she'd get up and start doing something in the kitchen, just moving, because she needed to move. Victoria was quiet. I'm not going to do that, she said. I know. I'm going to ask you what you need, she said. Before you go, while you're gone, when you come back. She looked at him steadily. Because those are 3 different things, and I don't want to assume I know the answer to any of them. He looked at her across the kitchen table. Before I go, he said slowly, thinking through it as he spoke. I need to know you'll still be here when I get back. Not a promise you can't keep. Just, I need to know this isn't the kind of thing that ends because of distance. It's not, she said, without hesitation. While I'm gone, he continued, Sophia is going to need, she's going to be okay. She's done this. But she gets quiet in a particular way around week 3, and it helps her to have someone who isn't Mrs. Patterson. Someone who treats her like her opinions matter. They do matter, Victoria said. I know you know that. He paused. She knows you know that. That's what I mean. Victoria nodded. And when you come back? She asked. He looked at his cold coffee. When I come back, he said, I'm going to need a minute. It takes me a minute to shift back. I don't always come home exactly the same as I left. I know, she said. You don't fully, he said, not unkindly. Not yet, but I'm telling you so it's not a surprise. She reached across the table and put her hand over his. James, she said. I've been building campaigns for veterans outreach for 4 years. I've interviewed men who came back from 18-month deployments and sat across from their wives who had kept everything running and couldn't understand why the person who came through the door felt like a stranger. She pressed her hand down slightly, grounding. I'm not naive about this. I went into this with my eyes open. He turned his hand over and held hers. You know what the hardest part is, he said. Tell me. The hardest part is not the leaving. He looked at their hands on the table. It's the moment right before. When Sophia is still asleep and I'm standing in her doorway at 4 a.m. with my bag already packed, and I have to make a choice about whether to wake her up to say goodbye or let her sleep and leave a note. He exhaled. I've made that choice 4 times. Every time I think I've made the right one, and every time I'm not sure. Victoria was quiet for a long moment. What did you do last time? She asked. Left a note, he said. She was 6. She'd cried so hard at the previous goodbye that she made herself sick. His jaw tightened at the memory. I thought the note was kinder. Was it? She didn't speak to me for the first 3 days of calls, he said. And on the 4th day, she got on the phone and said, You didn't wake me up. Not angry, just stating a fact, like a charge. Victoria pressed her lips together. What did you say? I said I was sorry, that I thought she needed the sleep. He shook his head slowly. She said, I needed to say goodbye, Daddy. Sleep doesn't matter as much as goodbye. He looked up. She was 6. She was right, Victoria said softly. She was completely right, he said. 7-year-olds are terrifyingly right about things. So this time, Victoria said carefully, wake her up. He looked at her. She'll cry, he said. Probably, Victoria said. And she'll know you chose to let her. She met his eyes. That matters more than she can articulate right now, but she'll carry it. He sat with that. Will you? He stopped. Started again. Will you be there that morning? I know it's early. I know it's... Yes, Victoria said, before he finished the sentence. Yes, I'll be there. He nodded. Neither of them said anything for a moment. Then Sophia's voice came from the top of the stairs, the particular voice of a child who has been awake for an indeterminate amount of time and decided that continuing to pretend otherwise is no longer worth the effort. Are you guys talking about something important? Victoria looked at James. James looked at the ceiling. Go to bed, Sophia, he called. I already went to bed, Sophia said with impeccable logic. That's how I got here. Go back to bed, he said. A pause. The sound of small feet on the hallway floor. Victoria. Sophia called. Are you staying for breakfast? Sophia, James said firmly. I'm just asking. We have the good cereal. Victoria was shaking with suppressed laughter across the table. Go to sleep, James said. We will discuss the good cereal in the morning. Another pause. Then in a tone of complete satisfaction. Okay. Good night, Victoria. Good night, Sophia. Victoria managed with tremendous dignity considering the circumstances. The small feet retreated. James sat across from Victoria with his face in his hands. She planned that, he said. Absolutely she did. Victoria agreed and finally let herself laugh. The weeks before the deployment had a quality to them that James recognized the particular brightness of time that is running out. He had felt it before deployments with Catherine, that sense of each ordinary day being slightly more itself than usual, the coffee tasting more like coffee, the morning light sitting differently on the kitchen floor. He had not expected to feel it again. He took Sophia ice skating on a Saturday afternoon, her idea enthusiastically executed, resulting in one bruised knee and enormous satisfaction, and watched Victoria negotiate the ice with the focused determination of a woman who had decided that falling was unacceptable and was winning that argument through sheer force of will. "You've never done this before," James said, skating beside her with his hands ready. "I've done many things before," Victoria said tightly, not looking away from the ice. Skating specifically, I may be approaching for the first time." Sophia skated past them backward, showing off, and Victoria watched her with an expression of pure betrayal. "How is she doing that?" Victoria said. "She's 7. "She's been doing it since she was 5, James said. "Catherine used to bring her every winter." Victoria glanced at him. He'd been saying Catherine's name more lately. Not often, but more. It came out differently now, not like something being pulled from somewhere painful, but like something he was learning to carry in a different way. More naturally, more at the surface. He thought Victoria noticed that. He thought she understood what it meant. "She sounds like she was remarkable," Victoria said. "She was," James said simply. "You would have liked each other." Victoria was quiet for a moment, navigating a careful turn on the ice. "I think that's the best thing you could have said," she said finally. Sophia looped back around and grabbed Victoria's other hand without being asked, and the three of them moved around the rink. Like that for a while, James on one side, Sophia on the other, Victoria between them, trusting that neither of them would let her fall, and James looked at them and felt something so large and so unfamiliar that he didn't have immediate language for it. It took him the drive home with Sophia asleep in the back seat, and Victoria looking out the passenger window at the passing lights to identify what it was. It was the feeling of a future. Not a plan, not a strategy, not a structure he'd built to survive. An actual future with shape and warmth, and the particular weight of people in it who had chosen to be there. He had almost said something right then in the car. He almost said, "I think I love you." He didn't. Not because it wasn't true, but because he was still learning the difference between knowing something and being ready to say it out loud, and he wanted to say it right when the moment had the right kind of gravity, not in a car at a stoplight with his daughter asleep in the back seat and his hands on the steering wheel. But he thought it. He thought it clearly and completely, and for the first time in 4 years, a thought like that didn't frighten him. It just felt true. The morning of the deployment was February 14th, which was the kind of irony that life occasionally delivers without apology. James noticed it and chose not to mention it because the last thing he needed at 4:15 in the morning, with a packed bag and a 6-week assignment ahead, was to have a conversation about Valentine's Day. Victoria arrived at 4 o'clock, as she had said she would. She rang the bell and he opened the door, and she was standing there in her coat with a thermos of good coffee and the expression of a woman who had decided somewhere in the night what her face was going to do today, and was holding it there through intention. "You didn't have to bring coffee," he said. "I needed something to do with my hands," she said. He took the thermos. Their hands touched in the exchange. "Ready?" she asked. "No," he said honestly. "Good," she said. "Go wake her up." He went upstairs. He sat on the edge of Sophia's bed and put his hand on her shoulder and said her name softly, and she came awake the way children come awake completely all at once from sleep to full consciousness without transition. She looked at him. She looked at the bag by the door. Her face did the thing. "Not yet," he said. "I've got 20 minutes. I'm not leaving without saying it right." She sat up and put her arms around his neck and held on, and he held her back, and they stayed like that for a while. "I'll call every day that I can," he said into her hair. "And some days I can't, but not because I forgot." "I know," she said. "And Victoria's going to check on you, not because she has to." "Because she wants to," Sophia said. "Right." She pulled back and looked at him with those eyes. "Come back," she said, not a plea, a direction, the same tone she used when she gave instructions about tomatoes. "Always," he said. He pressed his forehead to hers for a long moment. Then he picked up his bag, and they went downstairs together, and Victoria was sitting at the kitchen table with her hands wrapped around the thermos, and when Sophia came down the stairs, still in her pajamas, and sat beside her, Victoria put her arm around her without making it a performance. Just naturally, the way you put your arm around someone who is standing close enough to need it. James stood at the door with his bag. He looked at the two of them at his kitchen table. He looked at the crayon drawing on the refrigerator, new one, now more sophisticated than the one from years ago, but the same white navy hat, the same crooked letters. "My daddy always comes back." 6 weeks, he said. 6 weeks, Victoria said. Her voice was steady, almost. He opened the door. The February air came in cold and sharp. He turned back once. "I meant what I said," he told Victoria. And then, because he was running out of time and the car was waiting, and 6 weeks was 6 weeks, but some things couldn't wait, all of it. She looked at him across the kitchen. "I know," she said. "I'll be here." He walked out into the February morning. Behind him, through the door he hadn't fully closed yet, he heard Sophia say to Victoria in a voice that was working hard to stay steady, "He always comes back." And he heard Victoria say without hesitation, without the slight delay that indicates a person is deciding whether to mean something, "I know he does, sweetheart. I know he does." He pulled the door closed behind him, and he walked toward the car with the specific, painful, necessary courage of a man who has finally, after 4 years of keeping everything safely contained, allowed himself to have something worth coming back to. 6 weeks is 42 days. James knew that the way he knew most numerical things precisely automatically without having to calculate. He had counted deployments in days before. He had counted them in phone calls, in time zone differences, in the specific arithmetic of how many hours of sleep he could get before the next shift, the next watch, the next thing that needed his attention before he could think about home. This time he counted them differently. He counted them in Sophia's voice on the phone every evening he could manage a call. The hawk pigeon update resolved now in her favor, and apparently the subject of a class presentation she was planning with the full gravity of a doctoral thesis. The reading report. The update on Mrs. Patterson's cat, which had gotten into the garage again. The small, continuous, irreplaceable evidence that his daughter was alive and well and moving through the world at her usual speed, and he counted them in Victoria's texts. Not long ones. She wasn't a long text person, he'd learned. She communicated in precise, well-chosen sentences that said exactly what she meant, and nothing more, which was, he thought, exactly what her professional life had trained her to do, and exactly what made her rare in his personal one. Sophia corrected her substitute teacher today about Virginia State Bird. She was right. The teacher conceded gracefully. Raising her right. Council approved the housing funding. Third veteran moves in Thursday. You were right about showing up. Week 3. She got quiet today, like you said. We made pancakes. She said yours are better. I said, obviously. She laughed. She's okay. He read that last one 3 times. He read it standing outside a operations building in the kind of cold that doesn't apologize for itself. His phone screen the only warm light in his immediate vicinity, and he felt something move through him that was not quite relief and not quite love, but was made of both of those things, and something else that didn't have a clean name. She had paid attention. She had remembered week 3, remembered what he'd told her, done the thing without being asked, and then reported back in exactly the way he needed. Not, she cried, and I handled it. Or she had a hard night, but I fixed it, but she's okay. 2 words that contained everything. He called her that night instead of texting. She picked up on the first ring. Week 3, he said. Week 3, she confirmed. Thank you. James. Her voice was quiet. The particular quiet of late evening of a person who has gotten through a day and is sitting somewhere soft. You don't have to thank me for this. I know, he said. I'm doing it anyway. A pause. How are you? She asked. Cold, he said. Functional. Counting. Counting what? Days, he said. Differently than I used to. She was quiet for a moment. Then, 21 days. 19, he said. If the schedule holds. 19, she repeated. And the way she said it, like she was putting it somewhere she intended to keep it, did something to the center of his chest that no amount of military composure could fully manage. "How's the campaign?" he asked. "Done. Submitted." The client cried when they saw the final cut, which is either a very good sign or I made it too sad. "Was it true?" "Every word." "Then it's not too sad," he said. "It's just honest." She laughed softly. "I'm starting to think like you." "Is that bad?" "Ask me in 19 days, she said. He came home on a Tuesday. Not dramatically. Not the way homecomings look in the photographs that get shared around the crowds, the flags, the running across tarmac. It was a Tuesday afternoon, gray February light, a car he'd arranged for himself, because he hadn't told Victoria the exact time, only the day, because he needed the drive from the base to be his own. He needed that hour of transition, of being neither there nor here, of sitting in a moving vehicle, watching Virginia reassemble itself outside the window, and letting himself remember gradually what it felt like to be a man with a home to go back to. He stopped at the grocery store. He bought the ingredients for the good pasta and a bunch of yellow flowers that weren't roses, because he didn't want to perform romance. He just wanted something that said, "I was thinking about what you'd like," in a specific, rather than generic way. And a box of cereal, the good kind, the one Sophia had offered Victoria the night she eavesdropped from the stairs, because it seemed right to close that particular circle. He drove to his house. The lights were on inside. Through the front window, he could see the kitchen light and the living room lamp, and there was a shape moving in the kitchen that was too small to be Victoria and too purposeful to be Mrs. Patterson's cat. He sat in the car for a moment. Just a moment. Then he got out, walked to the front door, and knocked. There was a beat of silence, then the sound of running feet. Then a pause directly behind the door. He could feel the pause, the held breath of it. And then the door opened, and Sophia stood in the doorway in her school clothes, with her braids slightly sideways. The front part better than it used to be, but still, as she had acknowledged herself, a work in progress. She looked at him. He looked at her. "Hi, Dad," she said in the perfectly steady voice of a child who has spent 19 days practicing for exactly this moment and is going to hold it together for at least 4 more seconds. She made it 3. She crashed into him with the full velocity of a 7-year-old who has been waiting 42 days, and he dropped the grocery bags. Not the flowers, he managed the flowers, and caught her, and held her up, and she wrapped her arms around his neck, and her legs around his middle, and held on with the particular ferocity of someone who has something worth holding. He stood on his own front step, holding his daughter, and he didn't say anything for a while, because there wasn't anything to say that was more true than this. "The front part of the braid is better," he said finally into her hair. "I've been practicing," she said, muffled against his shoulder. "On the elephant. On Mrs. Patterson." "Sophia." "She offered," Sophia said. "She said it was good for her circulation." He laughed. He laughed with his whole chest, standing on the front step in the February cold, with his daughter in his arms and the yellow flowers getting slightly bent, and it was the best laugh he'd had in 19 days. Victoria appeared in the doorway. She was in a sweater he hadn't seen before. Dark green, her hair down, and she had a dish towel over her shoulder in a way that indicated she had been in the middle of something in the kitchen and had come out when she heard the door. She looked at him the way she'd looked at him that night outside the ballroom, past strategy, past performance, and she didn't run to him or make it theatrical. She just looked at him steadily, and her eyes said everything her voice wasn't yet saying. Which was, "You came back, and I knew you would, and I'm so glad you did." "Hi," she said. "Hi," he said. Sophia, still attached to his neck, said, "He brought flowers." "I can see that," Victoria said. "And the good cereal." "Even better," Victoria said, and took the grocery bags from his hand when he came through the door and pressed her lips to his cheek as he passed, and he felt that small touch go through him like something finding its way home. He needed his minute. He had told her he would, and he did. Not a long one, not like the early years after Catherine, when coming home from a deployment meant days of standing slightly outside himself, watching his own life through glass. He'd gotten better at the return. Therapy had helped. Time had helped. And something about having called every evening that he could, having stayed connected to the sound of Sophia's voice and the precision of Victoria's texts, had made the gap between there and here narrower than it used to be. But that first evening he was quiet in a specific way that he knew was his, that had nothing to do with anyone else, that was simply the necessary machinery of transition running its course. He ate the good pasta. Sophia informed him with scientific precision that Victoria's version was close, but his was still better, and he caught Victoria's expression of profound disagreement, held carefully in check, and he listened to the hawk pigeon presentation in its near-final form, which was genuinely impressive, and he drank his coffee slowly and let the house settle back around him. Victoria stayed for dinner and then began gathering her things because she understood without being told that evening, because he had told her weeks ago, and she had filed it in the right place, that the first night was his to have quietly. At the door, Sophia hugged her with the same velocity she'd used on James, slightly to Victoria's visible surprise. "Same time Saturday?" Sophia asked. "Same time Saturday," Victoria confirmed. Sophia went upstairs, already talking about what chapter she wanted to cover in the book they'd apparently been reading together on Saturday mornings. Something about a girl who could talk to animals. James had not known about this Saturday morning arrangement. He found, looking at Victoria in the doorway, that he had a great many feelings about it. "When did that start?" he asked. "Week 2, Victoria said. "She texted me from your phone while you were sleeping one Saturday, which I will mention is a security concern you may want to address." James looked at the ceiling. "She said you'd want her to have company," Victoria said, and her voice was soft now, the professional surface completely gone. "And she said she'd found a book she thought I'd like." "Had she?" "I cried twice," Victoria said. "It's about a girl who keeps going even when things are hard. Very subtle." He shook his head slowly. "She's 7, he said. "She's extraordinary," Victoria said. "Yeah." He looked at her. "She is." They stood in the doorway for a moment, the cold air coming in around the edges. "You're okay?" Victoria asked. "Really?" "Getting there," he said honestly. "Better than before. Better than last time." He paused. "Better because—" He stopped. "Because—" she said. He looked at her in the doorway of his house, the house that had been silent and preserved and load-bearing for 4 years, the house where he had stood in his daughter's doorway every night and told himself that providing and protecting and surviving was enough, the house where he had kept everything important in a cabinet below the sink so it wouldn't get bumped. He had something to say. He had known for 19 days that he had something to say, had rehearsed it, in no particular way, had just let it sit in him and become more true the longer it sat, the way things do when they aren't being forced. "Come to dinner on Saturday," he said. "Not the same time Saturday thing. After that. A real dinner, the 3 of us. I'll cook." "James," she said carefully, reading him, knowing him well enough by now to know that he was building toward something. "What are you doing?" "I'm asking you to dinner," he said. "You're asking me to something." He was quiet for a moment. "I love you," he said. Just that. The same way he'd said okay outside the ballroom, without performance, without preamble, with the full weight of what it cost a man like him to say it, and the full intention of meaning it permanently. Victoria stood very still. Then she exhaled a long, slow breath, like something she had been holding for weeks and weeks, finally being set down. "I know," she said softly. "I've known for a while." "Why didn't you say anything?" "Because it was yours to say first," she said. "And because I wanted to make sure you were ready to mean it forever, not just for tonight." "I mean it forever," he said, without hesitation. She reached out and took his face in both hands, the way you hold something you intend to keep, and she kissed him once, right there in the doorway, in the February cold, and it was not a dramatic kiss or a cinematic one, but the kind that means something specific between two people who have both lost enough to know the difference between wanting something and being willing to fight for it. "I love you too," she said. "I've been loving you since a hospital corridor and spilled coffee, if I'm being accurate." "You're always accurate," he said. "I really am," she agreed. From upstairs, a voice. "Are you guys doing something important again?" "Go to bed, Sophia," they both said simultaneously. A delighted pause. "Okay," Sophia said in the tone of a person who has achieved exactly what she set out to achieve. "Good night." The Saturday dinner happened, and the one after it, and the one after that. Spring came to Newport News the way it always did, gradually. Then suddenly the way most important things come. Victoria started leaving a few things at the house without ceremony. A sweater. A book. Good coffee, the real kind, in the cabinet next to the mugs. James moved them from where she'd left them to somewhere more permanent, and neither of them commented on it because the gesture said everything that needed to be said. Sophia informed them one evening in April, with the calm authority of a person making a formal statement, that she would like Victoria to come to her school's spring concert. "Both of you," she clarified, "together, in the same row, because Emma's parents both come and they're divorced, and they still manage to sit in the same row, and you actually like each other, so it shouldn't be hard." James and Victoria sat across from each other at the kitchen table, and neither of them trusted themselves to speak for a moment. "We'll be there," Victoria said. "Front row," James confirmed. Sophia nodded satisfied and went back to her homework. In June, on a Saturday morning, while Sophia was at her friend Emma's house, and the house was quiet in the specific way it gets when Sophia is not in it. A different quiet than silence, more like a pause. James made coffee and sat across from Victoria at the kitchen table and told her something he had been carrying for a while. "I've been thinking about the future," he said. She looked at him over her mug. "Specifically," he said. "How specifically?" He set his mug down. "I want to ask you something," he said, "but I'm going to ask it right. Not at a dinner, not at an event, not in a parking lot. I'm going to do it right." He looked at her steadily. "I want you to know that it's coming, because I don't want to surprise you with something that significant. I want you to have time to know it's real, and decide if you're ready." Victoria set her mug down. She looked at him for a long moment, the careful cataloging look she'd given him across the table at the gala the first night they met, the look he had learned was her at her most fully present. "James Calloway," she said slowly. "Victoria Hale," he said. "Are you telling me you're going to propose to me?" "I'm telling you that I intend to," he said, "when the moment has the right gravity." She was quiet. Then she said, "That is possibly the most Navy thing you have ever said to me. I prefer to call it intentional. I prefer to call it endearing," she said, and reached across the table and took his hand. "And yes, when you ask, the answer is yes." He held her hand. "You're not supposed to answer yet," he said. "You said you weren't ready to surprise me," she said. "Well, I'm not ready to pretend I don't know what I want." She looked at him with those green eyes that had been sharp and assessing the night they met, and had somewhere along the way become something else entirely warm, in a way that was specific to him, to Sophia, to the kitchen table, and the good coffee, and the Saturday mornings, and the late calls, and everything that had been built carefully between them. "I've known what I wanted since a farmer's market, and a very confident 7-year-old told me the tomatoes weren't good." He looked at her. Across the kitchen on the refrigerator, the latest crayon drawing was pinned next to the old one. The new one was more sophisticated. The white navy hat was still there, the same as always, but now there were 3 figures instead of 1. The letters underneath were straighter than they used to be, written by a child who had practiced her handwriting the way she practiced everything, with focus and intention and complete refusal to accept that anything was beyond her. "My daddy always comes back. Now we all come home together." James read it the way he had read the first one 4 years ago, standing in the kitchen at 5 in the morning with a cold cup of coffee, memorizing it like a set of orders he intended to follow for the rest of his life. He looked at Victoria. She followed his eyes to the drawing. Neither of them said anything for a long moment. Then she squeezed his hand, and he squeezed back, and the morning light came through the kitchen window and made everything in the room look the way things look when they are exactly where they are supposed to be. 1 year later on the beach near the naval base where James had spent the better part of 2 decades on a late afternoon in September, with the water going gold in the falling light, and Sophia running along the shoreline with Harold's grandchildren, and Mrs. Patterson watching from a chair with her good shoes off. James Calloway went down on one knee. He had not prepared a speech. He had prepared the ring, Catherine's setting new stone chosen with Sophia at a jeweler in March, on a Saturday, when Victoria thought they were at the hardware store, Sophia successfully maintaining the secret for 6 months, through what James considered an extraordinary feat of personal discipline. But he had not prepared words, because the words he needed were not the kind you could prepare. They were the kind that had been accumulating for 1.5 years in hospital corridors, and parking lots, and farmers' markets, and kitchen tables, and February doorways. And they came out now the way they needed to come out without editing. "I don't have anything to offer you that sounds impressive," he said. He was kneeling in the sand with the ring in his hand, and the water behind him, and Victoria in front of him, looking at him with her eyes already full. "I have a daughter who is going to interrogate you about bird species for the foreseeable future. I have a job that takes me away at the worst times, and a house where the street light on the corner has been out for 2 years, and I keep forgetting to call about it. I have a past I carry carefully, and a heart that took a long time to trust again." He looked up at her. "But I come home. That's the one thing I can promise without qualification. I come home. And if you'll have me, if you'll have both of us, I will spend every day I have making sure you never regret letting us keep you." Victoria looked down at him. Her face was doing the thing it had done the first night they met, the involuntary thing. The thing past calculation, past composure. 2 tears, one from each eye moving quietly and without permission. "You forgot something," she said. He looked up. "The question," she said, "the one from the gala." She smiled, and it was the real smile, the one where her eyes changed the one he had been collecting for 1.5 years like something worth keeping. "Ask me the right way this time." He understood. He looked up at her. "Are you good at staying?" he asked. She laughed a full, real, unprepared laugh, and she reached down and took his face in both her hands, and she said, "I've never been better at anything in my life." Sophia arrived at a dead run from the waterline, having apparently tracked the situation from 50 yards with the surveillance capability she had inherited from her father, and crashed into both of them before he was fully standing, and Harold raised a glass from his folding chair, and Mrs. Patterson said something to her companion that made them both smile, and the water kept moving the way it always moved, indifferent to the smallness of the moment and the largeness of it at the same time. James stood on that beach with his daughter in one arm and his future in the other, and he looked at the ocean that had taken so many years from him and given him in exchange the education of a man who knows what he's fighting for. The Navy had taught him how to leave. Catherine had taught him why coming back matters. Sophia had taught him that love is not a feeling you wait to receive. It is a decision you make every morning before the house is awake, and every night when the door is locked, and every moment in between when it would be easier to stop. And Victoria, who had asked a sharp question at a charity dinner, and cried at the answer, and called a second-grade teacher about a hawk, and showed up at 4 in the morning with good coffee, and read a children's book about a girl who keeps going, even when things are hard, and waited for a man who needed to say things first, to say them. Victoria had taught him something the Navy and grief and 21 years of service had not, that coming home is not the end of the story. It is the whole point of it. He was finally completely, irrevocably home, and this time he intended to stay.